Hey everybody, welcome to Hints and Guesses, my podcast. Kent here. Thanks for tuning in. I am making this podcast in December in Michigan, in really the most surprising turn of events in my life, at least in the last couple of years. One I never saw coming, not really in my wildest imagination. In fact, if you've been listening for a while, you know that we recently, my wife and I and kids, moved to Georgia, and that was really part of a 20-year wondering. My wife's from Georgia, and we thought maybe we'll end up there someday, and maybe we can make a life there, and we own a little bit of land down there, and really we sort of cashed in all of our chips and tried to make it work. And what's amazing, and I'm still not exactly sure what to say about it, and I think I need some time, but what became sort of painfully obvious to us is that it wasn't working. It wasn't quite what we thought, and there wasn't a resonance on the deeper level, on the soul level, and it took us both a while to let that play out. Maybe something like the stages of grief were at work. Denial. I don't forget them all right now. Denial, anger, bargaining. Or maybe it's denial, bargaining, anger. It actually, the sequence doesn't matter, but we really did give it a shot. And then for me, I can only speak personally, I had this little sense of it was time to broaden the circle. That was the phrase, and it was almost a feeling that I had created too small of a world, and it was time to broaden the circle. And as soon as I had that feeling, and we both did, in a way, all kinds of very surprising possibilities started arising, and one of them is the house that we're now in. We moved back to a little town called Ada, if you're not from Michigan, where we lived before, and just never in a million years did I think we'd be able to find a place where we could, first of all, where we could afford it, and be able to bring our horses, and yet here we are, and also we don't know how things are going to go. It's like we thought we were taking a risk moving to Georgia, and in a way that's totally true, but also it's a risk coming back, and we don't know how we'll make it all. We'll make ends meet exactly, but it feels right and good and gift and beyond our capacity to imagine. And right now I'm feeling really grateful. The place we bought has a little garage, and which was turned into an office, sort of like my old garage back in Michigan. And right now the sun is setting, and it's that kind of beautiful time of day here, and the light's coming in the window, and I'm just really surprised. Once again, I'm not the captain of my fate or the master of my soul, and I continue to be surprised by life. And so that's where I'm at, and I'm grateful that you're listening to this podcast. And I want to make a podcast today with kind of a troubling title. Actually, I don't know what the title will be. I usually make them after, but it's about making a deal with the devil. And it's kind of an archaic concept. We don't even really take it seriously anymore. Maybe if you go to church or you have a religious background, you're familiar with the temptation of Jesus, this exchange and this bargaining that goes on between Jesus and Satan, or Satan is the word in Hebrew, the accuser. And the Middle Ages are absolutely filled with stories of making a deal with the devil. And and I just thought of the devil went down to Georgia, and this whole notion of getting something or losing something, gaining something creatively, but losing something in exchange. Like Jesus says, what can you give in exchange for your soul? And like the blues guitarist that sold his soul to the devil, that sort of thing. Well, what is it that these stories are pointing to? And what have we lost just in terms of, back to the same word, imagination, when we no longer take them seriously? And either it's all up to me and my rational mind and my choices, and the universe is very square and rational and if-then, and sort of the materialistic world that's robbed of all mystery, really. What's lost? And we could even say, if that's not quite your point of view, what's lost when we no longer take the sort of temptation all that seriously, and when we don't take Satan all that seriously? When was the last time you even thought about that? In fact, it's a total guess I have. I'm not a sociologist, and occasionally I read studies about religious things, but definitely not my world of expertise. But I just have noticed a pattern that when people begin to question certain things about their faith, which I think is an important part of faith development and growth, that's been my experience. Doubt is a necessary ingredient in the evolution of faith, or even you could say in the evolution of consciousness. You can't move to another room until the room you have been living in feels too small and too cramped and doesn't work in some way. And there's a certain know that's necessary, even if you don't know what you're walking into. But anyway, one of the first things to go is, in fact, taking the devil or Satan, or you could soften it by say the evil one. That's actually a phrase from the Gospels. We say, I don't know about that. Really, there's a guy in a pitchfork who's trying to get me to do bad things. I can't take that seriously. And next to go with that often is the very notion of evil itself. I mean, if there's no Satan, maybe there's no evil. And but I think most people, that's a little too far. We're like uncomfortable. We know it when we see it, and yet we still don't know what to call it. Who do we blame for such a thing? Do we blame God? Do we blame Satan? Is it that kind of like bifurcated world? Everything good belongs to God. Everything evil belongs to Satan. Anyway, I'm not exactly trying to answer those questions, but I've just noticed that quickly that goes, and so then what do we think of human nature? I guess that depends a bit on temperament and of course on conscious worldview, but I think a bit on temperament and sort of disposition. When you peer into the human heart, what do you see? Do you see what we might call original sin? Do you see a kind of corruption there, a propensity to go after one's own wants and desires at the expense of something else? The orientation that not only is evil possible, but one is likely to choose it, or is it that actually human beings are just totally good? They're born completely good, and any corruption we blame on society or the systemic oppression or system or bad education, and really they're just innocent. And anyway, what we call evil is a construct, just like everything else is a construct. And maybe those are the two extremes, and I probably could have said it better, but you sort of get what I'm saying. Or is it somewhere in the middle? That's I have to say, like, in terms of this question, what's in the human heart, I think I've been really influenced by Jewish ideas along these lines. And I put them in my book, Bitten by a Camel, even though I would probably disagree with a few things in there now. But the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov, that in every human being is both the inclination to do evil and the inclination to do good. And they're potentials, they're living potentials. And that seems right to me. And I don't want to look at human nature as too good or too corrupt. It's probably both. And that's that to me, that's also stark. There's a kind of starkness to that, but it's also somewhat encouraging. And of course I'm turning things toward the human heart, which which is probably the only direction that we can go here, because I can't make an ontological claim and right now argue, definitely the devil exists. He's a being like any other being. Already I can hear myself like, wait a minute, what do we mean by being? And the greatest theologians have done the same thing with God. If God is a being like every other being, then God is not God in the way we understand being. Somehow God is beyond being or our conceptions of being. And we could say the same thing about evil, like about an evil one. However, personification is helpful. Part of what humans do best is exercise the imaginal muscle and projection. Like Marie-Louise von Franz says, thank God for projection, otherwise nothing would ever come out of the unconscious. And so when we would project onto God something like being or father, when we project onto the devil something like an evil one, a person, a being, an entity that's going to tempt us, it's like a bridge out of the unconscious, so it just doesn't remain this amorphous nothingness. So there's a place for projection, is maybe the simple way to say it. And so what's my point right now? Maybe I can just say it in a more direct way. When we don't take the devil seriously, what do we lose? And I'd like to suggest we lose something pretty important, and something that right now in the 21st century, I think is worth wrestling with, that has to do with human nature and our inclination to do evil. And so maybe we'll set aside the question of the kind of ontological question of the reality of the evil one and say, definitely inside the human heart is this possibility, this potential. And maybe we ought to take it seriously. In fact, here's a line from Jung that kind of, I think, helps us cross this bridge. The devil, he says, describes the grotesque and sinister side of the unconscious. And when he says the unconscious, he doesn't mean just the personal side of your individual psyche, but of everything that's unknown, the vast realm of the unknown, and the collective field of the unconscious itself. So the devil describes the grotesque and sinister side of the unconscious. And some people right now would just deny that is even real. And I'd say, and that's a grave mistake. He goes on, for we have never really come to grips with it, and consequently it has remained in its original savage state. Like even if we come to the temptation of Jesus and we say, instead of saying each of us in our own way, and maybe at certain points more than others, we're led out into the desert to look this savage state in the face. We say, we're not going to take it seriously. We dismiss it. I'm not going to go out to the desert to meet what doesn't exist. He goes on, probably no one today would still be rash enough to assert that the European is a lamb-like creature. And I'll just twist it slightly. Or that the American is a lamb-like creature and not possessed by the devil. And of course, this is someone, Jung, who witnessed and observed 2 world wars and wondered, what kind of possession is this? What kind of power is at work here? And what is it about the weakness of the human will or the susceptibility of the human individual to be absorbed by this kind of energy, to be taken by a kind of force? He goes on, the frightful records of our age are plain for all to see, and they surpass in hideousness everything that any previous age, with its feeble instruments, could have hoped to accomplish. What I read in there are things like chemical weapons and the atomic bomb. And now, the way wars are waged and raged in our present era. And we're at the cusp of having to take again seriously both what are societies capable of, but also what is the human heart capable of. And we don't want to be naive about that. We don't want to be naive about the possibility of world war. And I'm not here to scare anyone. In fact, in many respects, I think we need to hear the message of Advent alongside. And the major message of Advent of this season in the Christian narrative is no matter what, no matter oppression, global empire, power. I'm thinking of all the elements of the Christ story, of the birth story, of having to flee an evil dictator, of being on the very margins of society I was going to say unwelcome pregnancy, but that's only from a societal point of view. Mary, of course, says yes. Joseph says yes, but in an unwed situation, whatever, you know what I'm saying. All of the elements that make that story culturally provocative and dangerous in a way. No matter what, the major message is do not be afraid. There are forces, there are powers. There's the influence of the divine breaking in. So we need the message of Advent. So in other words, I'm saying both. Let's take a look. Let's go out to the desert and meet the devil. And I want to do that by mentioning just 3 stories here. The Handless Maiden, a bit of Faust, the Faust story, and the temptation of Christ. And I'm not going to go into tremendous detail, but I just want to circle around some of the themes here. Let's go out. Let's go out to the desert and say, have I taken the bait here? Am I capable of taking the devil's bargain here? And if so, what are the consequences? And that's not, none of us probably listening to the podcast are in a position of real political power or influence. I doubt it. I could be wrong. I'm not. So it limits what we can take responsibility for. But often what happens in the realm of these kinds of choices is we want to scapegoat. And we want to say other people are capable of choosing either. Other people are evil. Other groups are in their totality evil. I'm not responsible. And if we could just get rid of them and send them away, I could remain in a kind of purity. And that's not helpful. All we can do is take responsibility. And this reveals a bit of my bias. And I used to think it was, sort of a Jungian bias that all real change comes through individual attention here, which is the major work of analysis. But it's also, it's in Gandhi, be the change you want to see in the world. And it's all the way back to Christ. And that's not to limit other traditions here, but there's such a strong element of individual responsibility and salvation and a hard look in the mirror that is at the heart of the movement that Jesus was founding. Okay. So let me think of how I want to begin here. First, an advertisement. If you may not know, but for the last 7 years, ever since I started my training at Animus, in guiding and in what we call soul initiation, I've been meeting with people one-on-one. I call it companion guiding. I don't know if I've really ever mentioned it on this podcast, maybe just in passing, but hands down, from my point of view, this is some of the most important work I feel called to do in the world. I just really love meeting with people one-on-one. And some of the people I meet with, I've met with for the last 7 years. Sometimes it's just in for a season and then out. And anyway, I love it. It's an important part of what I'm trying to offer. If you want some kind of a description of what companion guiding is, you can go to my website, kentdobson.com. It's on there. Click on companion guiding. I have a kind of what is it, sort of few paragraphs. But I wanted to say that for me, like I just reached out to one of my mentors. It's the time of year for increased introspection, which is sort of, it just feels that way seasonally for me. And so I wanted to mention this is something that I offer, and I want to offer a kind of special. It's really for listeners of this podcast and for new people. if you've never met with anyone, like you've never had a spiritual director, maybe you've been in therapy, I'm not offering therapy. Again, you can read the description. I want to offer a little wintertime special. Ordinarily, it's $100 an hour. And what I'd like to say is 3 sessions for $250. So just a little bit of a deal. And that's all I'm inviting you to commit to. Now, if you don't like it after one, that's fine. We can work that out. But oftentimes I feel like 3 is, we're starting to get somewhere, and maybe you want to try it out. Maybe you want to talk to me for a while. Maybe you have some dreams that you need some help with, or you're at a kind of crossroads, or you feel stuck, or you're just not sure, or you're not even sure anymore what the right questions are. Or you have something specific. There's something you keep circling around, and you just need a mirror. You need someone to help listen, and maybe there'll be a resonance. That's usually how it works. Is sometimes there is and sometimes there isn't. But that's what we would find out, a resonance between the two of us. So I kind of wanted to offer like a wintertime, never met with me before, 3-session special. The way to do it, dobsonpilgrimage@gmail.com. Just send me an email. Tell me you heard the podcast and that you want to set something up, and I'll give you a little, sort of questionnaire to fill out to help give me a sense of where you're coming from. And then we can kind of go from there. So, would love, if that's something that, calls to you, I'd love to meet down the road. I can do it if you live in Michigan, I can do it in person, but most of the time it's over Zoom or on the phone. Okay. One more quick ad before I forget. I'm going to be guiding a program for Animas Valley Institute starting January 22nd. It's an online program. It's called Nature and the Human Soul, based on the book of the same name, Bill Plotkin's book. I'll be guiding with Gene, and Gene is a guide at Animas, very seasoned. He's been guiding for many, many years, and we've, I think, guided now 3 programs together in person. So it'll be great to be guiding together online. Anyway, it's a program designed to explore what Bill Plotkin calls the soul-centric developmental wheel. It's an 8-stage model. It's really a model of human development rooted in ecopsychology for the purpose of really cultural transformation, not just individual growth, but larger questions about what does cultural transformation look like. It's really the core work, the core map behind all of Animas's work. So if you've ever been curious about, well, really, what is Animas? What are they up to? What are their assumptions? What's the working model here? This is a way to explore that. It's going to be really fascinating. We'll cover all 8 stages. We'll talk about both the gifts and the shadow side, the mature and immature side of every given stage. And we'll have some practices, we'll have conversation. It should be a really interesting program. If that interests you at all, go to Animas's website. They handle all of that, animas.org, ANIMAS, animas.org. Look under their offerings. You can look under their online offerings. You'll see it. And would love to have you. You might want to act quickly. There is a cap, and we're almost there. So, just to encourage you, if that piques your interest at all, to head on over there and see if it's possible for you. So I think that's enough. I would like to turn our attention to these stories. Story number 1. I want to talk about the very beginning of a myth, of a story from the Middle Ages called the Handless Maiden, or sometimes called the Girl with Silver Hands. And it's one of the great feminine stories. Most of the themes, masculine and feminine are dimensions of the psyche from a depth psychology point of view. So it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, the story has some power, but it's usually considered to be one of the stories that tries to wrestle with what does it mean to grow up from a feminine point of view. Or what is the feminine story like? And that's often quite different than the way masculine-oriented stories like, say, the Fisher King or the Grail story are oriented. And So, but I want to mention just the very beginning of it, because the whole story is set up from a devil's bargain, from a deal, making a deal with the devil. So the story begins with a miller, and the miller, in addition to the family name, Miller, you'll hear the origins of it, was the person in town that usually was responsible for grinding grain, sometimes other products, but running some kind of mill. And a mill is a way of saving money. It's difficult to grow your own grain, harvest your own grain, grind your own grain, dry your own grain, store your own grain. And the role of the miller was introduced actually all the way before the Middle Ages in different forms, but a technological solution to the grinding of grain. So you're not just individually doing it. So you bring your grain to the miller, and the miller grinds it for a price. And it saves time. You can increase with time, you can increase productivity and efficiency and things like this. But the miller often was one of those mixed figures in fairy tales and stories, because it's definitely an advantage. It's a societal advantage from a technological point of view, sort of like the shift from, say, the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, all kinds of cascading effects just from a single change of metal. Well, the same goes with this type of technology. And so the miller was sort of like, it's kind of amazing that the miller learned this technology, acquired the knowledge for technology, but could also take advantage of people, could set the price, could change the price of wheat, could affect the economy in a certain way. So it was one of those like really untrustworthy figures in most myths, or that kind of like there's a shadow side. It's probably the best way to say it, how the miller was perceived. And so the miller is out grinding grain one day using the ordinary means, the technology up to that point, which is, turning the wheel, or sometimes with a donkey turning a wheel. And the wheel goes round and round, a sort of center pole, and it's somewhat efficient. And but it also, you either have to push it or have a donkey. And so the devil says, I'll teach you the technology, but it's going to cost you something, and it's going to cost you what's behind your house. And the miller thinks about it and says, okay, well, there's an apple tree behind the house. It's kind of old, does produce apples. I can live without it. Deal. So the devil teaches him the technology of using a creek or a river, a water source, to turn the mill itself. And now you have basically unlimited energy that doesn't cost the miller anything. He just plugs it up, so to speak, channels the water, unlimited, free, powerful technology that can increase efficiency and production and make him richer. And part of being richer also means some leisure here. So it's like, oh, he can see down the road. Well, I can make just as much money, if not more, and relax. Great. He takes the bargain. The devil goes away. Well, sometime later, the devil comes back to take his end of the bargain. And he says to the miller, let's go behind the house. And the miller says, fine. Grabs his axe, thinking he's going to chop down the apple tree. And instead, his daughter is standing in the backyard. And the devil says, she's mine. Now, this is a whole world which is worth exploring, because the story is saying, on one level, technological advancements, the masculine orientation of efficiency first is going to cost the world something. It's going to cost the psyche something, and it's going to cost society something. And what's it going to cost? It's going to come at the expense of the feminine. The feminine is going to be injured. The feminine way of seeing the world is going to be injured. And so what ends up happening is, like a lot of myths, horribly, the young girl, the maiden, her hands are cut off. The devil cuts her hands off. And she's ashamed. And obviously there's kind of a break with the father figure, with men in general, and she goes to the forest. Now, of course, there's more to the story, and you're probably wondering, well, what the heck happens to the Handless Maiden? Great question. You'll have to read the story yourself. I'm just interested in the initial bargain. And a couple of my orientation is, my influence is more in the realm of depth psychology, so I'm reading it psychologically. It's not the only lens that I am using in this story, but definitely from a psychological point of view, it's saying something like, when we choose efficiency, productivity, the rational, the sort of economic worldview as our dominant worldview, the sensitive, feminine, instinctual, creative is going to suffer. That's the feminine side of the psyche. And also we could say from a societal point of view, women are going to suffer. The young women are going to suffer in society. And it's amazing that this is in the Middle Ages. I mean, sometimes we think like the modern contemporary feminist critique of patriarchy is brand new. Well, not at all. I mean, even the Bible, believe it or not, I don't have time. You'll have to take my word for it for the time being, has a lot of criticism of the patriarchy itself. Think about the gospel narratives, the New Testament. It begins with women playing the dominant role here. Where's Joseph? He's hardly ever mentioned. It's a story about Mary, and it's a story about Elizabeth. And at the cross, it's a story about Mary Magdalene and about the mother of Jesus. So women play an extremely important role, and there's a kind of critique of the ordinary, masculine, patriarchal, rational and productive dimensions of society going all the way back to antiquity. And that's just to pick a handful of things. Okay, so back to the story. The line I'm going to give you comes from Robert Johnson. He's got a book about the Handless Maiden. You can check it out. And of course, he's a Jungian. So to help us understand what's at stake, he puts it in the most simple terms. The devil's bargain is when you and I want something for nothing. Want advancement, efficiency, and don't want to pay for it. Or, if you think about it in the realm of social credit, we want prestige, power, influence, name, identity, and we don't want it to cost us anything. We want something for nothing. And we're likely to take it. And like when people dangle things in front of us that seem like, oh, my life would get easier, we're likely to say yes to it. And when we say yes to it, something is going to suffer. It's going to cost us something down the road, and we just can't see it. It's behind the house. So a question you could ask, or a series of questions here, is, first of all, have I ever done that? Am I likely to take something for nothing? Like, yes, this job is going to provide something for me, but there's something like unethical or immoral about it that's not quite right, and I don't really want to look down the road at the consequences. I want the money, I want the prestige, I want the power, I want the influence, I want the name. And, to hell with the consequences, I'll just let them play out. Most of that is in the unconscious. It would take a certain amount of probably life experience to look at something that starkly, to say what are the unknown consequences down the road, and to imagine what they might be, and then to go ahead and choose one way or the other. I mean, maybe the wisest among us are like that, but oftentimes these are unconscious and quick. I'll just pick on social media, for example, because most social media posts are really about gaining social cred in some way. And I'm sorry, I'm going to say something that might offend the parents listening to this. I'm sorry and not sorry, but I often have this feeling like when parents post about their kids on social media, I think, what is it that they're promoting? Are they promoting their child? Are they promoting their child's well-being? Is this what's best for the child? Or are they promoting themselves and their sense of image? And more often than not, I know from experience, more often than not, it's about, well, I'd like to be seen as this kind of parent. I'd like my kids to be seen in this way, and it increases my social cred, so to speak. And okay, all right, maybe it's not that big of a deal. The question is, what's behind the barn? What are the consequences down the road? So I'm sure you can think of a million examples once you are kind of getting a sense of what I'm saying, but I think this is a fairly good one. It's why, like in my household, you have to be like me, and I'm definitely not moral and righteous and, some kind of saint, but I have made a commitment early on that if I was ever going to post something, I have to ask my kids permission. Can I post this picture that includes you? Because I know I'm kind of giving it away. It's no longer mine in a way. And in any case, some of this comes from my own wounds because my dad was a preacher and so was my grandpa, and they were always telling stories about me and about the kids. And you kind of like it, but there are downstream consequences. It's like, wait a minute, that's not really what happened. That's kind of, you're sort of using the story to say something else, and it doesn't feel quite right. And that's an example of, I think, just a small one of what's behind the barn. So ask yourself, am I prone to want something for nothing? In relationships, in dating, in online dating, in friendships, when am I likely to say, bite on that the devil comes knocking and says, yeah, but I could increase your level of well-being, your leisure time, and it's not going to cost you very much. Trust me, it's not going to really, I mean, it might cost you a little bit, but not going to be that big of a deal. And you don't see what's coming down the road. So that's the first dimension, just to think about. Okay. Story number 2 comes from Faust. And now Faust is another story. It really became much more popular in Germany because Faust was an actual person, and from Germany, who was what we could maybe call the original snake oil salesman. But like all snake oil salesmen, there had to have been enough truth to what he was selling that people lined up. And he went all around offering all kinds of little healing potions and making a living that way. And he was an alchemist by training. And this was an era in which alchemy was both respected and also people were a little frightened by it, freaked out by it. What's really happening? Can you really take base metals, for example, and turn them into gold? See, that's a classic example of the devil's bargain. Take something that's worthless and turn it into gold. You'll be rich. You won't have to work as hard, and don't worry about the consequences. So he's an alchemist. And now to make the legend kind of really explode, he died in some kind of alchemical experiment, messing with chemicals. And the story went around that he was so committed to his craft that he had made a deal with the devil, and the demons ripped him apart because he, exploded into a million pieces or whatever it was. And from that point on, the sort of phrase or the idea that Faust was offered a deal from the devil and he took it and he paid for it with his life, he lost his soul, so to speak, is what went around. And a bunch of different pieces of literature and plays and music was based on the Faustian story. And I didn't know much about Faust, even though I was a literature major and had to read even literature from this. I probably did have to read sections of Faust when I was in undergraduate work. I didn't really know much about it until I started reading Jung. And Jung is always talking about Faust, and he hardly ever explains what he's talking about. He sort of assumes his audience knows what he's talking about. But the most famous play comes from Goethe. And I'm just going to pull a couple of things from Goethe's story. It has 2 parts to it. Part 1, he wrote while he was still, he wrote both parts while he was still alive, obviously, but it was published while he was still alive. But part 2, he really did not want published until he died. And that's a complicated story. I'm not going to get into all that. But most of what I'm going to say about the Faust bargain here comes from Goethe, and Goethe's sort of amazing, some people say one of the most amazing works of literature ever written. Okay, so here's the opening of the story. Just like the story of the miller, I'm really much more interested in the opening. So Faust is a college professor at the beginning. He's made it. He's well educated. He's well liked. He's got a job, pays the bills. He's well respected. He's got students that work under him. He's made it. And he's in his office one day and he feels that creeping feeling of despair, like despair has entered the room. And he knows that in his desk is a vial of poison. If it ever comes to it, he's got this vial of poison, and he's contemplating really his own death here. And the meaning of life and that the kind of deeper existential dread, like I've made it. Or like Merton, I've climbed the ladder of success to realize it's on the wrong wall. And so he's feeling that. It's really a play about middle age here. And I don't necessarily mean you're turning 40. I mean just something of the first adolescent phase of life is over. And in this case, I've had some success and it's not doing what I thought. So he reaches for the vial in the story, and it seems like he's willing and is in a deep place of despair, willing to take his own life. And into the study, into the office comes a black dog. Now that's interesting in and of itself from kind of an archetypal point of view. And the black dog is walking around the room, and it's the shadow, and it's leaving these fiery footprints, and actually to kind of Faust's surprise, it wakes him up. It's like, whoa, maybe life is not what I thought. And there's this kind of like repulsion and attraction to the fiery-footed black dog. And the black dog goes behind the couch or a chair or something and emerges as the devil. And now it's time to have that confrontation. Now it's time to meet the devil in the wilderness. The Jesus story we'll come to in a second. And they're going to have it out. And in the Faustian bargain, it's kind of straightforward. The devil says, okay, how you feeling? Not so great. And Faust is sort of saying things like, I don't know if I've really experienced life. You know, I've had all these accomplishments and I have degrees even and a job, but I never really tasted all of what life has to offer. And the devil basically says, no problem. I'll offer you 24 more years of youth and experience in exchange for your soul. And Faust says, yes, I'll do it. I mean, after all, what's the point? You know, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. I didn't really experience life. I'll do some interpretation here. I got married too early. I was too righteous. I did the right thing. I went in for the career my parents wanted me to have. I married the right kind of person. I checked all the boxes. Or you could even turn a little bit and say, you know, I rebelled and, you know, I followed fish around and you know, did all the raves and they're empty, you know. So whether it's good boy or bad boy, I did the thing, but it's still not it. And the devil says, okay, I'll help you. I'll help you experience. I promise you deep experience, youth and vitality, and in exchange for your soul. And Faust says yes. And who would not? I mean, doesn't one part of you want to? That's part of, I think, that feeling of midlife depression is the lack of vitality. That's probably the simplest way of putting it. And sometimes it's like we would do anything to gain that spark of life back. It just doesn't come through means that are all that healthy. At least that's, I think, that implied here. And so first thing Faust does is go to the bar, which I think is funny. He gets wasted and meets a woman and kind of has a great time. It doesn't feel all that good and complains to the devil, you know, I don't really feel all that good. He's like, I don't promise you good feelings. I just promised you experience. So have at it, experience more. And so he kind of spins out from this place, you know, trying every possible, you know, whatever he felt sort of, never got his due. He's going to taste it all. And meanwhile, you can already guess what's happening. The state of despair isn't exactly going away. And in some senses, it's getting worse. And no matter what kind of experience, pleasure, wealth, you know, sex and drugs and rock and roll and, you know, the whole hedonistic treadmill, it doesn't seem to be really curing anything. And of course, the devil's not promising any kind of cure. He's promising just raw experience, being able to follow whatever just arises in the moment. Okay. Let me just make a couple of contemporary sort of connections, just to take it out of the personal for a second. Although that's the primary way I'm inviting you to listen to this. Like you could say, have I ever done this? Have I ever said to hell with the consequences and I'm going to take experience and eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die? And Or maybe you're right at the beginning, or maybe you feel like your hand pulling on that drawer, the drawer where the vial is, and you know the feeling of despair here that's hidden. You're not sure what to do, and at least the story is saying, yep, that's pretty normal. That's a pretty normal part of aging and of growing up, and something wants your attention here. And okay, so just think about some cultural things for a moment to see the way in which there are some cultural implications for this version of the devil's bargain. Think about our current health bargains. Now, I'm going to piss a few people off here, but think about all of the many, many, many pills we're offered. Now, right at the end of every single pharmaceutical commercial, we have that very quick laundry list of what could go wrong. Everything from like internal bleeding to death. And so it's like it's kind of thrown in there. There may be consequences, but don't worry about it. It's you're going to get something. All you need is a pill. Don't worry. It's just the apple tree behind the house. Don't look behind the house. And anyway, you'll have 24 more years of youth, so I don't know. I don't have cable television. I know how to stream it, so I occasionally do that. And the Olympics, I love the Olympics. The Olympics are awesome. And so I was like almost shocked how many pharmaceutical commercials were on in the Olympics. The very the global phenomenon of celebrating the human body and all of its talent and all of its natural talent is essentially funded by pills. There's something ironic about that, and I became much more obsessed with the news lately because of all that's going on in Israel and in Gaza and in Syria and in Lebanon. And I have friends in this part of the world. I have friends in the IDF. I had a friend call me from Gaza just the other day, a soldier on break. So it's like, and again, the entire media industry funded by this kind of what we call health care, but we might start to wonder something else. And again, this is why I'm going to step on people's toes here. It's the same thing with the vaccine. It's like, or the vaccines, or any vaccine. I know we're not supposed to question any kind of vaccine, but it's like, okay, here's a shot, here's a pill. Don't worry about the consequences. They'll play out. Or there's nothing to see here. See, no matter what you think, no matter what your beliefs are about that, and time will usually reveal more, and I'm comfortable with that. But you can feel early on, anytime there's a quick fix, we can feel ourselves wanting 24 more years of youth and to hell with the consequences. See, that's a cultural example of the devil's bargain. And I hate to always be picking on politics, but fair enough. You can critique me for that. All right. But it's like the number of politicians who are not funded by massive corporations and their interests is like down to just a handful. It's like really almost to be a politician is to be offered the Faustian deal. I'll give you power, prestige, influence, a name, vitality, gain of some sort in exchange for what? Well, you're going to have to do my bidding, overtly in most cases, but sometimes subtly and overtly you're going to have to lie and manipulate. So manipulate the system in such a way that it benefits your benefactors. See, that's the Faustian bargain. And that's to lose your soul. And I'm not saying politicians have lost their soul. I'm just saying you can see it there. You can see you could pretty quickly become the shell of somebody who originally got into this line of work because they wanted to serve the people. They wanted to serve the people that they grew up around in the most simple sense. And I want to watch out for the people in my neighborhood, how quickly that can get corrupted. I don't know if you necessarily need more examples. We could talk about, beyond just drugs, but just surgeries, longevity things, any kind of technology. I think the biggest looming one is going to be artificial intelligence, which I use. I use it on Google all the time. You can ask Google anything about these myths and it'll give you at least something. And this artificial intelligence, what an interesting name. And it's like, yes, but on the level of efficiency, on the level of gain, you can kick back and chill with your new robot. And I'm just saying, if the myths are true on some sort of deep level, which I really think they are, there are going to be consequences down the road. We're going to either lose our soul, or we're going to cut off the feminine, we're going to cut off the feeling function, to be technical. We're going to cut off the sense of value and meaning, which is always the danger with technology. Yes, we can. Don't really think about, is it meaningful? What's happening on the level of meaning and values? It's just, well, we can, so therefore we're going to. That sort of thing. I just want to explore a couple of more things in this story before we let Faust go. There's really so much I could say, but I do want to keep this exploration, this initial pass, somewhat brief. But it has to do with the question of redemption. And, okay, so say Faust takes this bargain. Is that it? There's just no redemption, no hope. His soul is the devil's. End of story. If you take this path, if you say yes, there's no possible way out. Well, that's not typically how myths work, stories work, at least not the great archetypally rich ones. Yes, you're led into the forest, but there are always like little breadcrumb trails on the way out. And Goethe's Faust is no different. Now, like I said at the beginning, there were Goethe's play was released at two different time periods. One while he was still alive, and that became a very popular play. And the second, he wanted it to be released after his death, which tells you something, like he was saying something controversial, and most likely, and I don't know, didn't want to deal with the consequences while he was still alive, or he thought what he had to say in some ways was so upsetting, it would just be better to be said after he was gone. And it turns out it is a little bit like that, because the question of redemption arises for Faust. It's not as simple as, yep, and the devil takes his soul down to hell and end of story. It's only, he takes the path of destruction and that's it. No, redemption is built into the story. And the first requires, and I want to talk about it in two respects: the redemption for Faust and redemption for the devil, because both of those become possible, at least in Goethe's imagination. So first, let's talk about Faust, and I want to back up for a second. Remember at the beginning of the story, I said he's sitting at his desk, a vial of poison, and a black dog walks in. Well, one additional detail that is essential, that in a way becomes a kind of deep pointer toward the possibility of redemption. Just before the black dog walks in, and as he's reaching for the vial, some beautiful music from the chapel or from the local church, some kind of haunting melody drifts into the window, and he's mesmerized. He's in a very unexpected state of ecstasy just for a moment, and then the black dog comes in, which is interesting. I mean, first of all, it tells you about the power of music. It tells you about, in a sense, the relationship between transcendence and music, or the possibility of transcending your given circumstances, and how music is a kind of key that unlocks a door to something more. And that seems to happen. It's like he has just a taste of goodness and beauty and transcendence. And in that opening, here comes the tempter. Here comes the devil, which isn't, you'll see in a minute, is not unlike the Christ story. It's like in the moment of connection with God, to be called, "This is my son," to be led in the Spirit in the wilderness, to spend time with the wild desert god also cracks the door for temptation. So it does make sense. But what happens in the story is when the devil finally comes to claim Faust's soul and he's taken to the gates of heaven, he has no story. He has no way out. He can't plead for himself and say, please, I made a mistake. It's like he doesn't have any excuses. He has to stand there in a kind of blind and open rawness and take responsibility. This is what I chose. This is my life. But along the way, along his many wild adventures for his 24 years, he met a woman named Gretchen who falls in love with him. And he kind of falls in love with her, but it's not really consummated. It's like the old stories from the Middle Ages of chastity, sort of falling in love, but there's a dimension of chastity. It's much more like that. Gretchen becomes a kind of muse for Faust, or maybe loves him more than he loves her. He's just in love with experience and newness and, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so at the gates of heaven, it's Gretchen who pleads to the Virgin Mary to let Faust in. And it works. And here's something I got from Robert Johnson. I don't want to go deep into this point. I just want you to hear what he has to say about it. He says, redemption in this sense comes through the feminine, not through the masculine, not through willpower, discipline, resolve, arguing, rationality, logic, but the love of the feminine. And maybe it represents on the one level what was lost early on, a sense of innocence. Or if we go back to the Miller story, the hands that are cut off, the innocence and naivety and feminine relational way of knowing and of understanding the world. It's like sneaks in at the end, which is unbelievable, really. And he sneaks in. He sneaks in, and the word for that is grace. That's actually the word that Robert Johnson uses. He says the Faustian story and Faustian redemption is about unearned grace through the image of the feminine, through that kind of sensitivity and innocence, and not through willpower, discipline, and force. All of the opposite poles of the masculine story. And it's kind of simple, by grace. Like even the worst of sinners, so to speak, the feminine comes along and supports. And so it's very beautiful, but it's even more rich than that, because while they're standing there at the gates, the devil gets distracted. He's like not paying attention and doesn't really argue that no, Faust made this commitment. His soul belongs to me. He gets distracted, and amazingly, he gets distracted by music. By beautiful music, just like Faust did right at the beginning. So it's a way of saying even the tempter, even the darkness of humanity, like if you go back to that Jung quote, to speak of the devil is to speak of that sort of darkness, that even that sort of darkness is can buckle in the presence of beauty. And the devil falls in love, in a sense, with the music of a choir boy. And there's a possibility of redemption. See, that's a very radical theological claim. It's not, by the way, it's not the only time that claim has ever been made. I think it's Origen, church father, also claimed that no matter how powerful the evil one is, the devil is, he can't resist the redemptive work of Christ. And in the end, all will be redeemed. Now, that wasn't well liked by everyone else in the church, but it's along the same lines. It's a similar kind of intuition, imaginative intuition. So I don't know, what can you conclude by sort of what Goethe is suggesting? It's not exactly theology straightforward, and it's almost like more of a hint or a guess, and even what Robert Johnson is saying about by mentioning and elevating the feminine here, like what do we imagine is going on? And at the very least, I'd like to say that no matter how many times you take the bait, the way out is grace. And any addict knows that. It's like AA, that's the first step, is to say that I'm powerless. And I can't do this. I am not the manager of my life. I cannot manage this. It's a kind of surrender. And the feminine sweeps in and argues the case for you, argues for your own redemptive case when you're at your lowest. It's something like that. And the other side is whether we personify the devil here as some kind of other, or think about it as an internal reality, that the potentiality for the darkness of the human heart, that even that is not beyond, even that is susceptible to beauty here. That beauty can turn even the darkest inclination away from the potential for acting on the worst of evil. Yeah, so in a way, I do believe in beauty. When we make the world a more beautiful place, when we make the small world that we inhabit, when we choose beauty. And Robert Johnson has one other point here. He says the first half of Faust, part number 1, is almost a kind of literalization of vitality. Like, oh, I know the way to a rich and deep and vital life is to redo the first half and have all the fun that I can have and all the experience. And he says, well, that's immature. The second half really is, and a more meaningful second half of life is to think about the return to vitality in the symbolic sense. Like what? Like music and art and dreams and ceremony and religion and insight. And the literalization of youth leads us astray, but the cultivation of creativity and the cultivation of a sacred life and all of the creativity that might imply is actually a return to vitality in the best possible sense. Okay, let's just let some of those ideas hang out there. Maybe you'll hear something in them. And I want to now turn the page to the temptation of Christ. What's interesting, first of all, and worth noting, is that the temptation of Christ is in all 3 synoptic gospels. It's not in the Gospel of John, but it's in the synoptics, which, I don't know, is a way of saying, definitely this is an important story. I say it's amazing that it's in there because there's something very human about it. You know, the idea that Jesus is the divine Son of God and is a member of the Trinity, these sort of given theological notions, took many hundreds of years to develop. And the Gospels represent some of the first expressions of the question of who is this figure? Is this figure divine? I mean, even King David, from a Jewish point of view, is called the divine Son of God, but they don't take that exactly literally. So is that what we're talking about, the literal Son of God here? And also, so the question between Jesus' humanity and divinity is already in the Gospels, but it's just the beginning of trying to work that out. And that's why I say there's something very beautiful and very human about putting Jesus into a position of even being tempted in the first place. And in some sense, it's very heartening, because if Jesus was tempted, how much more am I tempted to take the Faustian bargain, to take the Miller's bargain, to take some version of it? And the temptation story is interesting because, first of all, it's part of a larger story where Jesus is baptized by John in the wilderness. And I could say tons of things about that, very interesting in and of itself. And the first thing he does is not preach, teach, make disciples, heal people, but go to the desert for 40 days. There's something about that initial sort of divine encounter that happens at baptism. This is my son whom I love, with him I am well pleased, that requires archetypally, and I think literally, which is the way I read this story, I think Jesus literally went to the desert, that requires some self-examination. Like, who am I? What is this? What is this world? What does it mean to feel the pull of of God to be touched by the numinous and the divine in such a way. And so he goes to the desert. He's led by the Spirit, it says, to the desert for 40 days where he fasted, joining his ancestors, joining the already deeply embedded ritual and ceremony of fasting that was already inside Judaism, and sort of recapitulating things like the Exodus or the flood or the 40 days of Moses being on the mountain of God on Mount Sinai, or the 40-day journey of Elijah to the heart of the desert, this chunk of time that has come to mean so much to the Jewish people. And so Jesus spends 40 days. And I've fasted in the wilderness before, and any of us who have done that for more than a couple of days knows the kind of strange mystery that it entails, and a combination of just plain old boredom and occasionally it's like the whole world breaks open, and we realize we're caught in a kind of sacred mystery, and so it's something like both. And right at the end of all this, Jesus meets the tempter, the evil one, Satan in Hebrew, the devil. And he comes to Jesus with three possibilities. And I'll give you sort of my take on them. The first is, turn these stones to bread. Turn these stones to bread. And so what is this kind of temptation? And in some ways, it's a little like the miller here. And perhaps a little like the Faustian bargain. Like, you're not feeling so well. Take the easy path. And let's just say Jesus is the kind of person who can. A miracle worker. I mean, talk about getting something for nothing. And what's it going to cost Jesus? I mean, what is it going to cost to be like, you know what, I am hungry. Boom, bread. And see, it's not so much the question of the immediacy. It's the downstream consequences. It's what's behind the barn. What is the point here? Is it to gain something from nothing? Is the point of Jesus' connection with God, whatever that may be, however that might be described theologically or symbolically, the sort of center of power that seems to be emanating from Jesus, what is it for? And is it for personal gain? I also like that the devil says, turn these stones to bread, because bread is one of those things that is a several step process. It's like, it requires the work of our hands. It doesn't grow on trees, obviously. It requires something of our own labor, ingenuity, creativity, and imagination. And I think, at least one reading of this, is that the devil is saying something like, is life going to be about what you can make? If so, prove it. And Jesus' response is that, no, I don't dine at that table. Human beings do not live on bread alone. Human beings do not live on the work of their hands alone, and what they can produce and make and achieve and craft. There's a kind of nourishment beneath that. And so he doesn't. He said, I'll just live without. I'll take the experience of emptiness and just live with it and see what happens, and trust that there's a kind of nourishment that's deeper than whatever I can produce. Now think about that, because he's about to go and do things and make stuff happen and call people out and challenge people and heal people. And so he has to look in the mirror, in a sense. He has to look into the contours of his own heart and say, what is this really about? The second temptation is the devil, it says, takes him to the highest point of the temple, the precipice of the temple, which in some ways is a very real and literal place, the corner of the Temple Mount, the highest place, which I know from archaeology is in the southeast corner, where there was even in the archaeological excavations, they found a small carving that says the place of the blowing of the trumpet. It's the place where the priests stood to announce the daily sacrifice, or to announce Shabbat, or to announce the festivals by blowing the shofar, blowing the horn, blowing the that would blast through the city streets. So that corner. I mean, I don't know if really that's the one, but something like that. And so, in other words, let's go be seen in the city, and the devil says, throw yourself off and let's test God here. And after all, it says the angels will catch you. And this I'll steal a little bit from Henry Nouwen, because I think his reading of this story, I think, is a great possibility. And he says, in some ways, it's the temptation to be famous, to be like the wonder-working miracle man, leap from 1,000 feet and not die, like to be seen in that way. And he says, throw yourself off. After all, everyone will say, oh my God, literally, oh my God, who is this person? And they'll follow you. And Jesus says, no, I don't want to test God in that way. And who of us doesn't need to, at certain points in their life, look in the mirror and ask, is that what this is about? My name, my identity, my notoriety, my fame, my reputation. Jesus says, none of that is worth it. I don't want to play that kind of if-then testing game. And so he walks away from that temptation. And the third temptation is pretty straightforward. It's a temptation of power. And, the devil says, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world if you'll worship me, if you'll bow down, if you'll acknowledge that the center of power in that sense, from the city, from empire, comes from me, from the evil one, from the accuser here. And even more directly, it's the temptation of power. And who of us have not been tempted by power? Like, I've had lots of jobs where I've had even at a church, we always claim there was a flat structure. And we actually worked pretty hard at Marceau, where I worked to try and make things equitable and to have high levels of transparency. But there's still a hierarchy. You're still in a position of power. As the pastor, as the main dude giving talks, there's a kind of power associated with that. So it's like every day, in a sense, the devil comes and says, I'll give you more if you'll bow down and worship power, me. That this is about control and manipulation and getting what you want and having things go your way. And in a sense, I hate to be so critical, because I think there's enough criticism of the church, but many times in church history, the church has stood there in the desert with the devil and taken the road of power, not the way of powerlessness. In fact, they've taken quite the opposite path of Jesus. He lets that go. Says the first shall become last, and watch me. It's a way of saying that there's a deeper power at work other than the one that we ordinarily worship. And okay, so there's a whole lot more to say, but I was trying to keep this podcast at an hour, and I kind of want to just stop here, pause here, and ask you, really, the listener, what are you hearing? What's stirring in you? What are you hearing in these stories? Are there times when you've said yes to the devil's bargain? Are you facing one right now? And what would it look like if you brought that into the light of consciousness and said, wait a minute, what am I really after here? What do I really want? Who am I serving? What am I serving? A question that can cut right through this stuff is often something like, if I say yes to this, what is it in service of? Myself, my ego, my persona, my power, my prestige, my reputation, my wants, my desires, my own lust, my own greed, my own pleasure. What's this about? And who's going to pay the piper here? When the devil comes for his due, what are the consequences? What are, as far as I can see, what are the consequences for me? Or maybe you're in a place where you actually know already, like you said yes, and you're in the place of whiplash, and the devil has come saying it's time to pay up. Yeah, and so what's that look like to turn around and bring that into the light of consciousness and go in a different direction? All right, I've been wrong about this. Let me join the rest of humanity in being wrong about something. And, like T.S. Eliot says, humility is endless. I mean, this is a refrain that keeps haunting me, really. Humility is endless. In other words, it's something you can trust. I'm not talking about self-flagellation. I'm not talking about, this kind of undue shame. I'm not talking about playing a victim. I'm saying, no, humbly, I'm not the center of the universe, and I've made some mistakes here, and I've gone after things that I thought would gain me something, but instead are costing me something on the level of the soul, or on the level of my family, or on the level of, whatever. So I don't know, this feels like a good enough place to land the plane here, and I just want to thank you. I mean, if you made it to the end, like, oh wow, okay, you made it to the end of a podcast about making a deal with the devil. Well done. So I hope you heard a hint, a guess, a clue. I cannot thank you enough for your support. Thanks to my patrons. If you want to become a patron, patreon.com/Kent Dobson. That's the way to do it. It supports this podcast. It supports me. And I've got already another one coming down the pipeline. So looking forward to connecting with my patrons who keep this conversation lively. And thanks to the rest of you for listening. Please pass it on, and wishing you well during this time of year.